Hello, extempers, speech innovators, and everybody else listening to this podcast. Today, we have a pretty mild episode, I would say. It's not one of my favorites, but I think it's also really relevant to both Spencer and I since we're college students. AKA, today's topic is about student loans in the United States. What's up with that, right? I'm sure all of us have heard bits and pieces about what's going on with the Biden administration and how they're trying to cancel student loans or maybe not cancel student loans, or maybe they are, but they're not doing that much to cancel student loans, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, today, this is what that episode is, or today's episode is going to be all about student loan forgiveness. We'll get into the tea of that. But as always, I'm YuYu.
And I'm Spencer, and we're going to talk about the American system and why it actually sucks.
And this is the half hour. I kind of just had to throw that in there.
We are open to hearing any changes that you have. We love the structure that we have for our episodes now. We're not opposed to keeping the structure we have now. But I think to improve podcasts, especially since we've been around for a year now, we want to work to maybe make some changes. Because all podcasts are due for some kind of change, right? Whether you think that's questions first, which would be a weird way to do that, or if you think we talk more of different questions, or maybe have more of a broader focus on international issues, on economic issues, it's always up to you. We would love to hear the feedback, and we would be gladly appreciative of it. But we're not opposed to any structure changes. That's kind of the big thing that we want to talk about is as we start approaching to the next year, we anticipate that there may be some differences to how the podcast is ran and to how we structure episodes.
Yep. And I kind of want to also add in a mini disclaimer here. So yeah, what's up with student loan forgiveness, Spencer?
Yeah, student loan debt is a problem in the US. But exactly how bad is the student debt crisis in the US, and why does the problem exist? Well, accumulated from all citizens, the total amount of student debt in the US is 1.7 trillion. That is trillion with a T. This is across 44 million Americans, billion with an M. So it's a pretty big issue. There's a lot of Americans who accumulate a lot of debt. At the trend that it is going at, student debt could be at $3 trillion by 2035. So why does this problem exist? Well, this problem stems quite a while back, which is something that would be very shocking to a lot of people. In the past, the United States has passed the GI Bill, the National Defense Education Act, and the Higher Education Act of 1965. And each of these created better access for people to have a college education. These all were passed while tuition prices remained low. And obviously, for good reason, these are also in place. It gives people access to higher education. That gives them a chance to go to college. However, the new problem is that states have been cutting funding, which has forced tuition prices to increase. When we look at the 1991 to 1992 school year to what it is now, tuition prices have more than doubled. At public four-year schools, it went from $4,160 to $10,740. And at private four-year schools, this went from $19,360 to $38,070. In the 1990s, the average student debt was $5,000. In the 2018 to 19 school year, this debt increased to $35,000 per person. And on top of this, 70% more Americans hold student debt. So the reason why we look at these three bills as kind of like the start of it all is because it created access to higher education. So each of these bills are a result of the beginning of increased student debt, right? There is nothing wrong with the three bills that are passed. We're not saying that people shouldn't have access to college education. But what we're saying is that these bills created and paved a way for tuition or for more people to have student debt because they are the start of it all. And even worse, many students cannot afford the 10-year repayment deadline that colleges can offer. And lastly, more than 7% of those who hold student loans are more than $100,000 in debt. It's a lot of money we're talking about. And this is a huge problem. that does in fact need to be solved. People should just pay off their loans, right? Student loans are the only type of debt that is directly attached to your name, which means that when you are dead, you still have that debt attached to you. You actually die with your debt. It is something that is not like credit card debt. It's not like taking a loan out from the bank. It's not like any other kind of debt that you can have. Student debt is incredibly different. And this is, in fact, problematic, especially since we've noted since 2007, student debt has increased by 144%. So this is a crisis and this is a problem. Something needs to be done, whether that is, it might be debated on how that gets done, but something clearly needs to be done. There are four big reasons as to why student debt has increased so dramatically. The first one is that students now have greater access to student loans. That's great. That means more people can take out student loans and more people can take out higher loans. That sounds like a great idea. The second thing is, as noted earlier, states are not supporting higher education as much as they used to. So states are starting to see more budget cuts for universities. University of Wyoming, where I go to school, is a very good example of this over a long period of time. The University of Wyoming has continuously been cut by the state of Wyoming. The third thing is that loans are now easier to get than ever before. And before you are like, Spencer, you just said that students now have greater access to student loans. Well, we're talking about more general loans here. We're talking about plus loans and graduate loans that are also offered rather than just directly taking out a regular student loan. And finally, colleges and universities that are poor.
So, specifically, what is the government going to do about the student debt crisis, right? So we all know that the Biden administration very vocally said they were going to get rid of all student debt, or at least get rid of student debt to a degree. And I'm sure we've all heard that that plan was no longer really a viable option or on the agenda. So we're going to unpack what's actually going on today in my little tidbit. Currently, President Biden has decided to move forward with a plan to forgive student loans, but only a portion of student loans and only for those who meet the income requirement. So since coming into office, let's get this straight, that Biden has already canceled a total of $17 billion worth of student loans, but he hasn't enacted wide-scale student loan forgiveness. Remember, the total student debt is $17 trillion. $17 billion is kind of just a small little nibble of the whole thing. On top of that, though, originally, Democrats were calling for forgiving $50,000 worth of student loans per individual, and some are still advocating for this amount. However, Biden has zeroed in on only forgiving $10,000 for individuals that make less than $150,000 a year in terms of income, and couples who make less than $300,000 a year. This proposal has not been formally announced yet, and it's also important to note that the White House said things are still subject to change as they haven't fully finalized anything on their end. Furthermore, even if this bill were introduced, it's unclear whether the bill will be supported by Democrats or even Republicans who don't support forgiving student loans at all. But the Democrats I'm referring to are mainly those calling for forgiving $50,000 worth of student loans and those who just calls for the complete forgiveness of the $17 trillion worth of student loans too. So with elections on the line, it's even more unclear whether some Republicans will even support the bill or maybe politicize this issue to gain more votes. And politicize in this context would just mean using it to their advantage as a way to paint the Democratic Party as scheming and as just using this ploy as a way to gain more voters rather than actually caring about the people. So within the Democratic Party, there is mainly a split between moderate Democrats and more progressive Democrats. Democrats such as Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer have wanted to cancel up to $50,000 of student loans, while others such as Bernie Sanders wants to cancel all of student loans. Furthermore, Democrats who align with canceling student debt to some degree believe that it will gain them the votes necessary to help Democrats regain control of Congress. Reasoning behind this is because the majority of students who need student debt cancellation is those that are younger and those that are part of the Black diaspora in the United States. So Democrats feel that doing something like loan forgiveness could mobilize younger voters to vote, since they're the ones that majority of them are affected by student debt. And if they do policies such as forgiving student loans, it might incentivize those voters to go out and vote for them again. And like the reasoning behind why this would necessarily mean Democrats gain more control of Congress is because younger voters tend to vote more left than they vote. It's known for being a more progressive position, so it would be unappealing to those who are more moderate. To keep it a bit more simple, though, with these potential economic ramifications in mind, it can dissuade moderate voters from voting for the Democratic Party, especially with like the recent rise in prices and inflation and all that good jazz that's making life harder for all of us to live, things like that. Doing something like student loan forgiveness would have political ramifications on the economy, which then dissuades moderate voters for voting for the Democratic Party. And I say like moderate, but I'm also like referring to moderate voters who are moderately Democrat, but also like independent voters who don't align with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. In terms of making political decisions about student loan forgiveness among Senate Republicans, there is less diversity in decision making there. So they all basically agree that you shouldn't do student loan forgiveness, but there is diversity in the reasoning behind why the US should not forgive student loans on a mass scale. The main points that Republicans tend to bring up is that it's a ploy by Democrats to weed out Republican voices and decision making, because it seems like the Democrats are using it like as a tool to gain more votes. Other than that, though, Mitt Romney and other Republicans have also created legislation to prevent the forgiveness of student loans in response to talks about legislation forgiving student loans. Other reasons why Republicans feel that it's a bad idea is that they argue it's unfair to the people who have already paid off their student loans. So if you just forgive student loans now, what about the people who already like contributed money, who already paid back their student loans, et cetera? What happens to them? Other Republicans have criticized the bill as something that panders to the rich, because those who have student loans are those that went to college and potentially make a higher income now because they received college education. This is potentially why we see an income cap in the student loan forgiveness legislation that Biden seems to be proposing, just simply as like a way to account for income disparities, and just to say that like if you make over this amount of income, you obviously don't really need like student loan forgiveness because it seems like you can pay this off. On the flip side of that, though, Republicans have also argued that it's a socialist ploy to redistribute the wealth and to give resources away for free. And I think it's because of this reason why student loan forgiveness, even if it is a good idea, in my opinion, won't really end up passing in like the next year or so, just because the party lines don't really agree on like what exactly it is they need to do in order to pass this legislation. And also, because it's like a 50-50 split in the Senate right now, and it could be, it's predicted to not be like controlled by Democrats after the elections, it's going to be even harder to pass legislation like forgiving student loans in the Senate.
Absolutely. And this is going to be a interesting topic. This first question is great. I did want to make a correction, just a reminder of what I mentioned. I know you said $17 trillion. It was 1.7 trillion. All right, here is this first question, and it is, would a cancellation of student debt improve Democrats' chances in the midterm elections? I'll go ahead and start with this one because I've got a lot to say about this question, and that is, this is not the way this works. So if you've heard me talk about this before, I've mentioned this in a podcast before, maybe once or twice, I don't remember at this point. The way that elections work in the United States doesn't give Democrats a chance at all in the midterm elections. But in reality, we know that there's actually one real answer to how the elections are going to be. The United States has what is called a minority party powered system. So what that means is the party that is not in control typically win. So in 2022, as once again a preparation for the midterm election, might be our starter episode for coming back. We'll think about that. But the easy prediction is it's going to be a Republican win. Like we don't even have to think about this too hard, right? If this is the way that it is and Democrats are in control, then Republicans are clearly the minority party, thus they're going to win, right? That's how the system works. And this is pretty evident in the last few administrations. Obama in 2008 had Democratic control in both houses, and it was lost to the Republicans won in 2010. And this is a problem for Democrats I really don't think that this is even a good move for them in terms of like a political scale. Unfortunate, yes, but reasonably speaking, this is not their best idea. I think that this is a pretty clear no. I think UU lays a really good argument in her point as to why it could be yes, but once again, my argument there is that it's primarily media driven, and that's typically what we see as a result from media, and oftentimes the media is in fact wrong.
Yeah, I think like to provide the different perspective and say the explaining the yes answer to this question of would a cancellation of student debt improve Democrats' chance in the midterm elections? What could happen is now that you've forgiven student loans, it actually appeases to these voters who either don't generally vote that much because it's like the younger generation that you're appealing to, but also like appealing to the Black diaspora who is disproportionately affected by student debt and by the student debt crisis. Other things to think about is just that like within Biden's own administration, it seems like the only downfall, or not the only downfall, but the main downfalls that his administration is kind of facing in terms of public opinion is it seems that his administration isn't really doing anything or can like contribute to anything meaningful. And that could be really beneficial for the Americans who are suffering from the student debt crisis, etc. And so that could be another reason why it's really powerful for the Democratic Party to pass this legislation to show the American voters that no, like the Democratic Party, the Biden administration is doing something for the American public and they are doing something for the good of the American public. So I think these are a couple of other points that you can consider when you're saying no to this question. But I don't really have anything else more to add. If Spencer doesn't, we can move on to the next question.
I'll just add one tidbit, and that is, I've mentioned this. I've actually never mentioned this on this podcast. I've talked to YuYu about this though, but maybe I have. I don't remember. Tell me if I haven't. But the federal government has not really done a lot to deal with national political issues, and it's something that has been very well noted in recent years. There is a, I know I definitely posted this to Instagram, but we know that the last time the federal government passed something dealing with national politics was the Affordable Care Act in 2010, which means that we really haven't had the federal government fixing a problem that's dealt with national issues in 12 years. That's hey, that's a red flag. But what we've actually seen is, and this is the part that I haven't shared with a lot of people, is that since 2000, and since pretty much the turn of the millennium, maybe a little bit earlier, there's been an increase in states taking control of national politics. So what this means is, if you've noticed, states have been the ones to take action on gun reform. States have been the ones that take action on climate change. States are the ones that have been taking action on critical race theory. States have been, all of these like hot button national issues have not been touched by the federal government. That's a sign of a problem and that the federal government's not fixing something. So kind of to mention to YuYu's point of how this legislation is kind of unlikely to pass, this legislation is more likely to pass in a state. And I think more like a state like California too, where YuYu's at, right? California is more likely to pass a student forgiveness bill than a state like Wyoming or a state like Texas or a state like Florida right now. So reasonably speaking, national issues are going to be handled more by states. And I think that also furthers the answer to this as a no. Like what we mean is it really, when it's come to national politics, it's really been the states recently. And that's why I think the Affordable Care Act is a good indicator of, it's been a while since we've had something passed, but up for debate. Let us know on Instagram.
Yeah, we could be completely wrong. Again, we're not experts. It's just like the general trend that we have observed both in classes and also just own intuition through looking at the news. But I think like this conversation actually ties in really well to the second question, which is US higher education in need of significant structural reform? I guess like I'll go ahead and start. I think from what we've talked about in this episode, US higher education is obviously in need of more significant structural reforms, just because of the fact that what Spencer said, like colleges are teaching about college problems. They're teaching us about like the student debt crisis, and they're teaching us about all of these problems within the university and within like higher education that just don't work for students. I think it's a clear indication that what we've been doing for such a long time in terms of how we're dealing with administrative tasks, how we're dealing with tuition, and how we're dealing with just whatever students need on a daily basis has been like pretty poor and needs structural reform in order for like meaningful change to take place on the higher education level. And like, I guess with this question, you can like dive into the deeper ideas of like, oh, should it be done on the state level? Should it be done on the federal level? But I also think like maybe this is something that needs to be done on a federal level, just because if you leave it up to the states, it can vary like state by state, which means that there is not like equal change among these universities across state lines, in which case you have some universities that could fare better than others because some states just care more about structural changes to the university than other states do. Like, granted, this is talking about mainly public universities that do rely on like federal funding, but also know that or private universities also rely on like public funding as well to kind of maintain their own university system. On top of that, though, like if you answer this question, you obviously need to like create solutions, or not like necessarily like full on solutions, but like create ideas of what structural reforms could look like or what they would be. And in terms of like talking about that, I think of avenues that you could like go about addressing this question. You can go with things that are tangentially related to the structure of higher education, which is talking about student debt forgiveness, what we talked about in this episode. You could also go outside of that bubble and like more specific to university administration stuff, basically just saying like changing the way that the universities has been making decisions about regarding like student life and also like student education in terms of what they're charging for classes, how they're dealing with housing, etc., things like that. Because I'm sure like Spencer and I have both felt the effects of higher education administration lacking in their ability to provide for their students. I guess like one example I give, which is a little bit tangential to this topic and not really related at all, it would just be like mental health care services on student campuses being more accessible and things like that. I know throughout these past couple of years and what has happened just in our personal lives, mental health has like become a really big issue in terms of just dealing with everything that has happened in the past couple of years. But on top of that, we're also going to college and dealing with the stresses of higher education. And if universities or administrations can't be bothered to either fix the way that they're providing access and like mental health care to their students, then it might be a problem and cause a lot of things to go wrong in terms of student life and like student learning abilities, I guess I'll say. But there's a lot of ways that you can go about discussing the type of structural reforms that higher education needs. I'm only going to give you a couple of examples, but I do think the answer to this question is yes.
Oh, this is a def yes. I think that this is a nonpartisan yes. I do think that Republicans do believe that higher education has problems, and it's very much illustrated out there about it might be the things that they teach, it might be the things that they do, it might be whatever. I think that this is a definite yes, though, that there are problems. There's a really interesting one. I've mentioned this to you, learned it in my perverse incentives class. And that is colleges actually, most people are leaving college with their bachelor's degree not learning anything more than what they learned in high school. That is an issue. There's actually there are arguments out there. There was a pretty big study that said that students have walked away from college saying that they thought it would be harder. Surprise for a lot of people, college is not as hard as you think it is. Now, I know Stanford is a totally different story, so you might have a different answer on that. But there are studies that say like public universities, it was mostly done on public universities, have been easier than what people thought they were going to be. And people got through it with a breeze. And there's a lot of big deals with marketing. Okay, there are a lot of big problems with how higher education has been dealing with how it educates people, right? And it's not as well as we originally anticipated it was going to be. And I think it does, in fact, fall short on being able to provide people with a good education. And I do agree with the study that, I mean, my experience is it's been relatively easy. But there's a reason for that. Teachers have to be a part of course evaluations. Okay? Course evaluations are they've got written portions and whatever. And people are more likely to fill out a course evaluation for a teacher that's given them an easier class. That gives that teacher a higher rating. And on top of that, that higher rating is more likely to give that teacher tenure. Okay? So those that are relatively easy, people will take more classes with. So it's in a university's best interest to hire teachers that are easier so they can continue to have better ratings, which means that students don't actually learn as much as they do now. That is not just that is kind of the administrative issue that you mentioned. It's not just an administrative issue, though. It's also a teaching issue, right? I'm not saying that teachers are bad, but there is a problem and that they are kind of forced to teach easily so they can have tenure or be insured with their job, get extra benefits, whatever. So college is easier than what people think it is. Surprise. The second point I want to bring up is the grading system. Okay? And this might be a shocking argument, but the grading system is actually outdated. The A 90 to 100, B 80 to 89, C 70 79 is no longer an accurate representation to how people perform. And that is a interesting kind of structural reform that might be an interesting discussion. Don't know. But what we know is that the grading system is actually really bad. It used to be, from what I understand in colleges, that an A would be like a 93 to 100 or something weird like that. But the regular A, B, C, D, F grading system is due for a change. It's an idea that was years ago that we established, and the way that students should be graded actually deserves a better method, right? It could be pass fail. It could be implementing something that really shows the comprehension of learning a little bit better than A through F. But I think that is a structural reform as well, is talking about grading. I think this is a harder argument to find on the internet when you're doing research in 30 minutes, but there is evidence that suggests that this is not as simple, or that this is not as accurate in telling how well you've learned as the current as the system could potentially be.
Yeah, I'll like echo a lot of what Spencer is talking about in terms of like what college life is like. I think there probably is like lots of disparities in terms of how college is to some students. Like some people's college experience is way harder than other people's college experience, or just depending on like how you learned in high school and what type of classes that you learned in high school, it could be a dramatic change in college. For me, I feel like college has been the same level of difficulty as high school. For context, like I did IB, which is like similar to just taking a whole bunch of AP classes, I'll say, but it's still like a lot of reading, a lot of writing, things like that. I kind of genuinely think that right now I probably do a lot more. But also it's dependent on how much effort you're willing to put into. I will also say that. So like there's a lot of factors that influences what your college experience can amount to. But I do like agree with Spencer's sentiments in terms of how tenure works and how like tenureship is decided. In my CS class, we literally talked about like how these like sites where you're rating your professors or where you're giving your professors evaluations is influenced by the way that that professor teaches, but also like just simply their own like individual identification of who they are could be influencing the way that students are composing evaluations in terms. There's like a lot of inequality involved with that, because recently the project that we just did was just evaluating the biases that could happen between different gendered professors. And like, as always, kind of the professors who identify as men get more positive reviews and positive ratings than the professors who identify as women. And like this in itself is a little bit like binary in terms of which genders we are evaluating. But I'm sure like if you apply it to a whole range of genders, it still will be similar in that professors who identify as men are getting the higher ratings, are getting like the really excellent, I guess, kind of reviews from students. And just because of like the natural biases, or not natural biases, I would say, like, but like the kind of ingrained biases that we have just growing up in our like this type of American culture, but like this type of world culture too, things like that. And it's not that I'm like saying, oh, men are horrible. It's just like recognizing that in the United States, we do have like a general bias towards men, and like we tend to forgive a lot of the things that they do, or like view them in a more positive light than any other kind of group or diaspora in the United States. Observation, not really like anything too politically powered, I guess. Regardless of what you think about that, tenureship is a big issue in terms of like the structure of the university. And I would also say like regarding like things regarding the student body, or like how they're deciding which professors are good and which professors are bad, is a process that needs some structural change too. Yeah. I don't know if you could say no to this question.
I think that this is a pretty nonpartisan no.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have heard I don't even think like I said, I don't think I've even heard any like Republicans being like, yeah, higher education's
Mhm.
fine the way it is.
Mhm.
Like, I just heard across the board that that something's got to change with it, right?
Right.
I think there's a disagreement on the change, right? And
Yeah.
I'm sure we're not bringing up a argument that somebody on the other side would say, right?
Mhm.
But there is definitely like it is almost like overdue for a change.
Oh, I will say, like, okay, just to bring up the other side, I think one argument that Republicans would make is that in higher education, it seems that professors are indoctrinating their students in certain ways, or some professors are, in terms of how professors are kind of talking about certain political issues and kind of revealing their own biases in the classroom, which, because of like the power dynamic between teacher and student, students are more likely to kind of like be more biased towards that teacher's perspective, and it could be like a form of indoctrination. So the structural change that a Republican might make is, hey, teachers should not like input their own political ideologies or like their own personal beliefs inside the classroom, for more inclusivity, and also for more like just like a neutral space for ideas to be shared and ideas to be criticized, talked about, et cetera, to like foster more diverse conversations and diverse perspectives, I guess, is like a structural change that I've heard on like that Republicans have made, things like that.
I think that's honestly you meant for Republicans to make too
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, because there are some professors that do this. I will note that I have had a professor that has done this, and even though that professor is really good, you got to be careful, because you shouldn't let that happen, right? You need to have a space of like college is supposed to be a space of thinking and some intense critical thinking, right? And yes, we should be doing both sides. I do think that that is a somewhat of a problem. I don't think it's as big of a problem as it's made out to be, but there are some that are very much doing that, and that is somewhat problematic.
Yeah.
I
I
think
mean, I think it's a fair assessment too. Like whether or not I actually agree the space in education should be just like a neutral space to evaluate all perspectives equally, I'm not necessarily sure, but I do agree with the assessment that like if it is a professor kind of like teaching in a way where they are just promoting this one belief, it's really like harmful to kind of diverse thought and like student interaction.
I don't have any more for this question. This is a question that's got a lot of research to it, though, so you might want to spend some time researching this question a lot more in depth,
Mhm.
because like you can go a million ways with this question. We've hit the main points, but there's a lot more that are out there.
Yeah. Writing a paper about this for one of my finals in class, and I could definitely tell you there's so much literature. It's really a difficult time trying to narrow down the topic. But yeah, like always, go do your own research. I hope you get the one in the round. If you don't get the one in the round, let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM email, maybe call if you have our numbers. Spencer or me, we're always available, mainly even like at 3 a.m. at night. I don't know. I mean, I am available at 3 a.m. at night. Make sure to follow our social media on Instagram and Twitter at the Half Hour Extemp Podcast. We do a lot of cool things on there. You can vote, you can engage with us, etc., etc. Follow those socials. But besides that, if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button. It's red because that indicates you're not subscribed. So subscribe, and also ring the bell so that you are notified every single time that we post a video. We post earlier than these get posted on One Clap. So please ring the bell, subscribe. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we will see you all later.